So the Sikh Human Rights Group proudly presents our environmental and diversity speaker series. Today's topic, how to save our oceans and marine life from man-made destruction. Today you'll be listening to Professor Rick Stafford from Bournemouth University, whose research interests cover numerous topics. For instance, a large portion of his work is currently focused on the politics and economics of environmental issues, especially climate and biodiversity loss. It shows that consumer choice is an unrealistic argument for environmental solutions, and that developed countries cannot afford to continue to pursue economic growth and successfully tackle these issues. The Global South, with appropriate, could contribute to green growth along with significant decreases in socio-economic inequality. More recently, his work is focused on green recovery plans in the UK, but plans which are also applicable to many other developed countries, and how these can contribute to climate and biodiversity solutions. Finally, he has also worked extensively with nature-based solutions, especially in the marine environment. For example, he is particularly interested in the relatively unexplored issues of overfishing and their contribution to climate change and/or their well-understood contribution to biodiversity loss. For example, he has suggested that changes to fishing practices should be implemented to benefit local communities, whether deprived fishing villages in the UK or food security issues in Africa, and that doing this will help as well as the overall ecology of the ocean. Recorded live on the 30th of September 2021, this is the 8th podcast in Sikh Human Rights Groups 2021 Environmental and Diversity Speaker Series. Welcome, Professor Stafford, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks very much for
Professor, Professor, can I please ask you to begin by telling our audience a little bit about the invaluable environmental and marine conservation work that you and your colleagues have done in the past and are currently undertaking?
Yeah, of course. So my background is in marine biology, and my degree and PhD are in marine ecology, and I do mainly focus on marine environments, but I do work across multiple disciplines. That's really because conservation is a multidisciplinary process. It's not just about nature, it is about people as well. But my work comes at it from a slightly different angle. I often combine ideas through different types of computer models, but they do tend to have direct policy and practical relevance. So some examples, and you have touched on in the introduction, things like effective measures to combat the major environmental threats which we face at the moment, which are really climate change, biodiversity loss and pollution. And to do that, we do need green jobs, renewable energy, insulation. All those things are important, but they're not enough for rich countries to just do those. Part of the reason for that is actually they boost economic growth. While it's not having a major negative effect, it's not really having any positive effect either. So it could be a way that some developing countries can actually sort of boost their standards of living and not contribute to the environmental problems. But in rich countries, we also do need things like large carbon taxes, ending fossil fuel subsidies, and a commitment to things like nature-based solutions. So some of the comprehensive Green New Deal strategies which are out there are really good for that. Within the marine sector, I look at artificial reefs for marine conservation. It's a slightly controversial topic, and with climate change going the way it is, even if we do curb it to 1.5 degrees, we are going to lose a lot of coral reefs. They are going to bleach and they are eventually going to die. And artificial reefs aren't going to replace those coral reefs across the entire globe, but they can provide some localized benefits. And we're really studying that both in the UK and abroad. And that's those benefits which will actually apply to the communities living nearby, including whether they can actually use that for food security and catching more fish. I have been working quite a lot in nature-based solutions. So they are essentially large-scale landscape features, such as forests, for example. They always benefit biodiversity, and they also have other human well-being benefits. And one of the key things is they can also capture carbon, so they can work for helping the biodiversity crisis, but also the climate crisis as well. I'm the chair of the policy committee for the British Ecological Society, and I was also the lead author of their Nature-Based Solutions report, which they put out recently. And I had a strong focus on the marine ecosystems within there. And that's kind of fed into my current research, which you've mentioned around sort of overfishing and the effects of that on carbon. And that paper's actually just been accepted today, I'm pleased to say. But it does kind of show that because we're removing lots of biomass of particularly predator-based animals, and the number of animals in the ocean is far higher than the number of plants or primary producers like plankton in the ocean. By removing those high level, high predatory fish, we're probably limiting the ability of the ocean to capture carbon and therefore further exacerbating climate change.
Thank you very much. Dr. Rai, could I please ask you to briefly introduce yourself and Sikh Human Rights Groups environmental policy?
Yeah, hello, thank you. It's a pleasure to meet you. The Sikh Human Rights Group started in 1985, and our focus was essentially human rights documentations for a long time. But in 1998, we also diversified into the environment as a human rights, the right to clean air, the right to food, the right to sustainable the environment around you, and things like that, really. And we participated in the 2002 Johannesburg conference on sustainable development, which is part of the continuing Rio conferences. We finally managed to get a consultative status in 2015 and have been increasingly participating in environment and climate issues as well. Our running theme throughout is pluralism, really. And we see that the environment and climate issues have been tackled from essentially one perspective, one civilization, without looking at how other civilizations have successfully in the past managed to evolve sustainable in farming, for instance, or environmental relations, and even the ecology of waste and things like that. And sometimes in many civilizations, there are spiritual, cultural, and other aspects which tend to strengthen their relationship with the environment, which have completely been almost completely ignored in the modern conventional environmental debate. So there is, as you rightly said, it's a very economics-based or anthropocentric based argument that this is going to be destructive to us, so let's protect it, rather than one that has a respect for what there is already, a more spiritual or empathetic connection with the environment, which then starts a very different debate. So what we are pushing is for a pluralistic debate and discourse in the whole environmental field, so that it can be looked at from many perspectives.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rai. We're going to begin today's discussion by delving into a variety of prominent environmental and marine conservation questions. I'm then going to give the floor to my colleague, Ms. Bethan Walters, who will ask you a few questions on diversity and inclusion-related matters. So my first question for you today, Professor Stafford, is, well, the oceans seem limitless, but we've come to realise that they are not. So therefore, in your expert opinion, what state are our oceans in today?
It's a good question, and I think the answer is they're not in the best condition by any means. They are heavily depleted and they're under major stress from multiple sources, and it can be that combined stress that's the real problem. So just some examples. If we look at fishing, we know at the moment around about 30% of stocks are overfished, which doesn't sound that much, but then a further about 60% are fully fished. So one of the issues with fully fished is actually we are taking out about 70% of that stock to fish at something called maximum sustainable yield, which is, while it is sustainable, as in the population will grow back all those harvested fish over the course of a year, it's still 70% smaller than it would be if it was in a natural state. So that's around about 85–90% of the stocks we have are fished right down to that level. The other stocks are actually called underfished, but while they are still sustainable, they may not necessarily be in a good environmental condition. Certainly their populations will have been heavily depleted based on natural levels. So fishing's taken out a huge number of fish, but also can cause environmental damage. So particular types of fishing can destroy the seabeds, for example. It doesn't mean all fishing is bad, and hopefully we can touch on this later. It doesn't mean that at all. It means at the moment we're probably overexploiting the number of fish we take out of the sea. We've also got climate change as a major issue. There's species which are moving towards the poles as different areas begin to heat up, so they're moving towards cooler water. Those species can essentially become almost invasive in the areas which they're moving to, which can cause problems. But just the heat itself is also a major issue. So the bleaching of things like the Great Barrier Reef and multiple coral reefs, which we hear now about pretty much every year, is really driven by the ocean surface temperature. So as it's getting hotter, it's causing that bleaching. There may be a few other factors which are involved, but they're very minor in comparison to the role of temperature. There isn't just coral reefs. The same things are happening with kelp forests and other habitats. They are struggling to cope with the rising temperatures which we've got. We've also got coastal pollution. So particularly things like nitrogen and phosphorus levels can be quite high around the coast. That can be from agricultural runoff into the waters. It can be from fertilizers. It's probably a better situation at the moment, particularly in developed nations, in terms of things like sewage. But nevertheless, there are still areas with very high levels of nitrogen and phosphorus. We've also obviously got a lot of plastic in the ocean, and while I've perhaps mentioned in the past that that's not such a big issue as fishing and climate change, it is something which we should be addressing, and it's probably another stressor on lots of different animals and plants which live in the sea. So it's depleted, it's under major stress, and there aren't necessarily that many regulations to effectively manage it or conserve it. The coastal fringes of the oceans are probably much better managed, but there's still, in general, there are few effective regulations and processes to really sort of manage and conserve what's going on in the ocean. So I think, to say they're not in a good state and they are heavily depleted and under major stress from a number of sources is probably the best sort of answer I can give.
Yes, that's excellent. Thank you very much. My next question, Professor, is we've recognised for more than a century the importance of preserving land. For example, through the establishment and maintenance of national parks and other designations. Therefore, and again in your expert opinion, why did it take so long for state governments, international organisations, NGOs and conservationists to turn their attention to our oceans?
Well, you're absolutely right. There has been a much longer history of preservation and protection on land. Having said that, it is worth some of that protection probably is not adequate. So there are still issues on land, but I think the question is absolutely right. It's taken it's taken longer to see those effects in the sea. And I guess that's really because a lot of the time we don't know what's under the sea. There may be, there are some places in the world, obviously, where people are very aware of their coastal ecosystems. But as an example, within the UK, I think we often think of the sea as a complete dead zone. It's not at all. We've had some projects going out and diving just sort of locally recently, and the amount of fish is quite staggering. You wouldn't think this is just under the water in the UK, but there is that sort of tendency, and I think that's true in a lot of the world. And in some cases, culturally, people don't tend to go into the sea or at least sort of explore underwater. So there is that sort of out of sight aspect to the marine environment. One of the other things, I guess, technology has also improved. So things like fishing technology and boat technology has helped to keep sort of fish catches relatively high up till quite recently. In some cases, still, despite the fact that we're depleting the populations of those fish. So by putting more essentially effort in through the use of technology, we haven't necessarily seen some of the declines as clearly as we might have expected. One thing that we now have, and it has really sort of come up in the last few years, is we now have quite a lot of protected areas in the marine environment, at least on paper. There was a target from the Convention on Biological Diversity for 10% of the oceans to be protected. We didn't quite meet that globally, but certainly on paper, there is a large amount of area of the ocean which is now protected. The problem is a lot of that's not really protected in any meaningful way. Most people would think of marine protected areas as, for example, not allowing fishing. But actually, they do allow fishing, and they allow multiple types of fishing. I think it was in the news around sort of December, January this year. But again, in the UK, there were super trawlers in the English Channel and fishing in marine protected areas. They were doing that legally. The bottom trawling, even by really big boats, was not a forbidden activity in those marine protected areas. So while we have seen that change, it isn't necessarily something that's working particularly well. The best marine protected areas, though, and this is something I think that happens at a global level, do at least work with local communities. And they do need to work with local communities. They do need to understand the needs of those local communities and the concerns of those local communities. And they shouldn't really be disrupting the livelihood and food supply. But marine protected areas can provide a good nursery ground for fish and actually benefit catches and things in the long term. It's something that actually a lot of indigenous communities have understood for a very long time. And even in places like Papua New Guinea, there have been seasonal closures of different areas for hundreds of years, where they've purposely closed areas to fishing in order for those stocks to recover. And I think we're perhaps learning from that a little bit now, that actually working with local communities alongside some regulations where they do need to be in place is actually the best way to manage these marine protected areas in the sea, and it's managing them for biodiversity and for people.
Thank you very much, Professor. That was extremely insightful. Dr. Rai, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
I think you're absolutely right. The oceans have been neglected for a long time. I think it has been seen as the big dumping place where we can throw things and it just goes into some sort of a oblivion. We don't see, whereas if you dump things on the ground, you mess things on the ground, then you can see the effects immediately. But it's becoming increasingly obvious to climate scientists and to people like yourselves that the oceans have a huge impact on the climate. So it's not just the carbon emissions from people, but how the currents go into the oceans and how oceans warming up a little bit, going northwards. And if more of those fish go northwards, then the temperature rises a bit more, and it has a direct impact on everything else. And there's been a lot of study on, I understand, a lot of study on that. So the ocean has become, I think, the next big thing to study. But human habits have not really helped with the large amount of shipping, the waste that has gone down. And now I think there's got an alarming report about trying to dig minerals from the bottom of the oceans. The impact of that on the sea life there is not yet known, because that sea life is not dependent on sunlight. It has its own luminescent way of steering through that very dark waters. And if those stocks die, what will be the impact of that? I think I think in 2021 at least, there has to be a greater awareness that when human beings do something, the risk impacts have to be done before they embark on something. The whole of last century, we have embarked on things, the Brave New World, without understanding, without knowing the impact of that. I think the ocean is very, very important.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rai. Professor Stafford, my next question for you, and we've touched upon this in quite a lot of detail before, but what are the most prominent issues and or challenges that we're currently facing when it comes to preserving our oceans and marine life, and how can they be overcome?
Yeah, I mean, we've probably mentioned the major challenges, but how can they be overcome is obviously a different question. I mean, climate change is something we really need to act on very urgently, and we've obviously got the COP, the Conference of Parties, in November in Glasgow, and fundamentally the thing that we really need to do at that conference is to commit to reducing carbon emissions. We don't necessarily have to have a brilliant net zero carbon budget and work out everything at the moment, because the science behind things like nature-based solutions can be quite uncertain. But we do know we need to reduce emissions, and that's what we need. That's what we need to see. We need to see real commitment to reduce emissions, and reduce emissions very, very quickly. Otherwise, the effects of climate change will get bigger. To some extent, the oceans actually suffer a little bit more, because as the temperature warms, the majority of the heat is actually absorbed into the oceans. And once that begins to change things like circulation patterns, as we just heard, there can be bigger changes to the climates. So potentially there can be tipping points and things from the oceans heating up. So first one really is to reduce carbon emissions, and that needs to be, hopefully there will be a strong agreement at that November meeting. Fishing obviously is a major challenge. And it's not necessarily bad to be taking fish out of the ocean. There are a huge number of benefits of eating fish. We know about some of those health benefits, but just in terms of the micronutrients which are in some fish, it's really hard to get those to certain areas. So particularly places like Africa, coastal communities in Africa are really, really dependent on fish for nutrition. So we shouldn't necessarily think of fishing as bad, but we do perhaps need to stop some of the over exploitation of fishing. We shouldn't really need fish to go into pet food, for example. We shouldn't necessarily, and I think particularly in more developed countries, we should be seeing fish as, equivalent to something like venison or something like that. You know, we understand that was a wild animal and should be treated with respect, and obviously they're probably more expensive as a result. But fish, you know, fish really are wild animals, apart from the farmed fish, which have all sorts of problems of their own. So I think reducing the need to understand we need to reduce fish and perhaps fish in a different way, and to use methods that don't destroy habitats. So things like bottom trawling can have major effects on the habitat, might release carbon back into circulation that's been trapped in the sediments, but also can destroy things like deep sea coral. Those are things which need to be addressed. Part of that could be through effective marine protected areas and partly through other regulations. We also need to think about sort of economic development and what's really beneficial, because economic development in some countries has really created a lot of habitat destruction. So prawns and shrimp farms, for example, have often destroyed mangroves, particularly, you know, in tropical areas. So as those mangroves go, firstly, they're really good at capturing carbon, but they also provide excellent coastal defenses. So where there have been sort of major effects of tsunamis or major effects of storms, actually having those mangroves could have avoided that, but they've been destroyed in order to create things like shrimp and prawn farms in a lot of cases. So I guess, you know, those are kind of the major things that we need to address. How can they be overcome? Essentially, it is either restoring some of those habitats or stopping doing new developments, reducing the amount of fish and looking at how we fish in particular, and carbon emissions from climate change.
Thank you very much. Dr. Wright, can I put the same question to you, but also ask more specifically, what would you like to see coming out of COP26 this November?
I think I'd like to see two things. One, targets specified and countries committing to those targets, so that the emphasis is not so much on the waffle and the ethics and that we must do this, we must do that, but specific targets, and science has to start and technology has to start rolling back, not its developments, but how to reduce the impacts, the destructive impacts, the side effects, the collateral damage it has managed to do. This was one of the themes in a book we wrote for UNESCO. UNESCO had started a whole exercise on developing universal ethics of environment, and we said that our position was you can't have a universal ethics because different civilizations have different approaches to how they connect with the environment. Some have a anthropocentric, that we are custodians, some have a very cosmological, that we are just one of the many species and therefore have no more right to the environment than others. But we put in the book that what the United Nations should be emphasizing is targets. Targets can be agreed by across cultures and across civilizations. So we say we want to reduce the carbon by 1.5%, and then let different cultures and civilizations find their own means. So setting targets would be one of the most successful outcomes. I think the second thing will be, if it does happen, is to take a more pluralistic approach and to encourage different cultures, etc., to make the climate and the environment and the oceans to be part of their cultural expression. So people, not just governments and industry and NGOs, but the common person has to take ownership of what is going on and be involved in that and be taking greater, not responsibility, but pushing for those checks and balances on the policies of the state and policies of industries. And that can only happen if people in general can make a connection with what is going on through their own cultures. I mean, for the example we have given in the past is the Muslims will not eat pork. Okay, and you can bring all sorts of economic arguments, but it's just not going to cut through. So we don't have that sort of a cultural connection with preserving the environment, preserving the oceans, preserving that sort of thing. And if there is that bedrock of resistance by people, then countries and industry will be obliged to find different ways rather than cost cutting every time. I think an appreciation that there was already a lot of wisdom there before, and you have also rightly pointed out that in some fishing communities, they preserved some part of the sea for it to regrow again the fishing stock. So there always was a wisdom of preservation and sustainability, which we need to start respecting and bring into the debate a bit more.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rai. Professor, now I know this is an area of keen interest for yourself. What are the foremost impacts of commercial and recreational fishing on marine ecosystems?
A lot does depend on kind of the scale of that, and recreational fishing can be often fine. It obviously depends on exactly what species are being targeted and by how many people. So something I've got perhaps a bit more knowledge on than some other species, but UK bass, for example, often sea bass, is heavily caught by recreational anglers. It's probably about 30% or so in some estimates have said that it is caught from recreational fishers. But without additional commercial overexploitation, I don't necessarily see there is a need to be stopping recreational fishing. There are some regulations on it. You can only take bass of a certain size and so on. And it's very often encouraged now to put fish back. So in terms of recreational fishing, maybe not too much of an issue. There can be bigger issues with the really big predators, particularly things like sharks and tuna and swordfish and so on. Just because the populations are so small and they have been so heavily exploited. Actually, recreational fishing has been shown to be quite beneficial to science now. That there are scientists working with recreational shark anglers to collect data. We have people in our department who are doing that. So it can provide benefits. There's probably a little bit more education that needs to go into that to avoid things like poor handling practices when fish are caught, but then they can be tagged and released till we can get good data, which we wouldn't be able to get otherwise. So it's there's probably quite a limited effect of recreational fishing, and that probably gets slightly bigger, but again, not hugely bigger when we consider sort of artisanal or small scale fisheries as well. The inshore fisheries in the UK or the artisanal fisheries in many countries kind of fit that role. In general, they have they take less fish and they work with more ecologically friendly methods. That's not a hard and fast rule, but it's a general sort of trend that does happen. It does depend on the numbers. Some places do have probably far too many artisanal fishers. I've done some work in Ecuador, and I believe the numbers at the time, which was about 5 years ago, something like 160,000 artisanal fishers along a coastline that's probably about the size of Wales. In some cases, there may be too many, and they may be causing damage. But in other cases, the amount of damage that they cause is probably relatively low. it's the larger boats that tend to use the more destructive methods, tend to have more power to use those methods. So things like bottom trawling is probably the most damaging of all the fishing methods, particularly when it's over sensitive habitats like deep sea coral, or if it's done in shallow waters on seaweeds or rocks or anything like that. But those larger boats also catch the biggest volume of fish. That's not necessarily illegal, it can be within quota, but I think one of the issues that you find from larger boats, and I think probably touch on this a little bit more later on as well, is that those boats then probably ship into one or two large ports, and it therefore lacks some of the benefits of more localized fishing to the localized communities as well. So there's effects on there's bigger effects on the marine ecosystem from having those larger boats, but there's also big effects on sort of the local communities that live by the coast of those larger boats as well.
Thank you very much, Professor Stafford. I'm now going to give the floor to my colleague, Ms. Bethan Walters, who's going to ask you a few questions on diversity and inclusion related matters.
Hi there, nice to meet you. So I'll get started. Was it on? No, sorry. Sorry. Hi, nice to meet you. So yeah, I'll get started. So usually when people think of our oceans, they won't naturally think of any of the human rights issues that are kind of attached to that and what are at stake. So therefore, can you please give our listeners a slightly more enhanced insight to the human rights atrocities that occur within our global fishing industries?
Yeah, I mean, I think to some extent, obviously, there was a lot of controversy within the science community around the documentary Seaspiracy, and clearly it wasn't all quite as factually based as it could have been. But one thing I really did think it did well was raise some of the human rights issues. So slavery, for example, is a huge issue within fisheries. And I don't think before that documentary many people really realised that. So it's probably especially prevalent in Southeast Asia, but it can be prevalent anywhere. And again, it's these larger boats which are the main cause of the problems. Partly because they'll fish further offshore. They can often fish in international waters where any kind of legislation and regulation is much harder to apply, and they can stay at sea for very long periods of time. So other than occasional drop-offs of fish or transfer of fish to other boats, they can often be out at sea for several years at a time. And that makes conditions for either very, very poor working conditions, very low wages, or actual slavery, completely illegal practices to be going ahead. And again, the other kind of major issues, I guess, would be very low pay, very poor health and safety can all exist. And again, this is more prevalent in the larger boats which go and fish in international waters. That fish in international waters is very often actually not even economically viable. It's heavily subsidized by governments as well. So there does need to be a lot more regulation on those boats, particularly around workers' rights. I think that's probably the biggest human rights issues.
Thank you very much. I'll move on to the second question then, if you want to jump in at any point, Jasdev. So some parts of the world are obviously more danger than others when it comes to the polluted oceans. So therefore, can you please provide us with an example of how large-scale fishing has jeopardized the livelihood and or safety of a country or region?
Yeah, I think the biggest and probably best documented issues are really around food security, and probably Western Africa is the best studied sort of location. There's been a lot of illegal fishing in the area for decades. So again, large boats fishing offshore without legally being allowed into those waters. So they might be in the exclusive economic zone of those countries, but they don't have permission to be there. That has included boats which have been registered in the EU. And those large boats have really taken lots of those fish, particularly the sort of the smaller pelagic fish, which are normally caught by the local fishers. So that's reduced the stocks. The other thing that's happened at the same time as that, which has really caused big food security issues, is there's been fish meal plants which have been opening up within that area. So even when the smaller fishers are actually catching fish, rather than sell that fish to feed or directly feed their families or to sell the fish into the local community, they're getting higher prices if they take those fish to those fish meal plants, which essentially is going into pet food and things like that. So that large scale fishing has firstly massively depleted the stocks, but the larger scale fishing industry and processing industry has really caused some major food security issues, particularly in Western Africa. That's probably the biggest example I could say. But actually, even if you look at something like the UK, if we look at the old fishing towns, places like Lowestoft, Grimsby, particularly around the East Coast, but it's probably true around most of the UK. Most of those old fishing towns are now amongst the most deprived areas in the UK. And that's really because small scale fishing isn't profitable. There's been studies by Greenpeace, for example, that have demonstrated that actually 2/3 of the UK's fishing quota is controlled by 25 businesses. So for some people, fishing can be hugely profitable, but that means that for the majority of people, around 70% of the UK fishing industry is actually in small scale fishing. It really isn't, and that's having effects. That's causing deprivation of towns which don't seem to have any other sort of businesses. So yeah, there's a real problem there as well.
Thank you. That was really insightful. I learned a lot then. Dr. Wright, do you want to add anything or ask any questions?
I think Professor Stafford has explained very well. I'm not sure whether I can add much more to it, but one of the things we're doing in, let's say, in farming is to, because farming is also going in the way of big agribusiness. Its impact is that, or collateral impact is where food might be cheaper, but it's also increasing poverty. And so more people on social security, more people looking for jobs, and things like that. And similarly, it seems to be the same dynamics happening in fishing. That if big international companies dominate the fishing industry, then one, it affects sustainability. Secondly, it drives a lot of those traditional communities into poverty. And whereas fish might be cheaper, but in the long run, it doesn't make economic sense because the state has to provide for those communities which have been driven into poverty. So I think, yes, we need to look at these things a bit more comprehensively, that there are some fields in our life and the life of the state and the life of economics where big is not necessarily beneficial because its collateral damages are far more. And we need to find ways of sustaining the smaller sectors.
Thank you. I'll pass you over to Carlos now.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Wright. I only have one final concluding question, Professor Stafford, and that is, there's clearly a lot to be done at an international level, and quite clearly at local level as well. And in that vein, is there, in your opinion, one small thing that we could all adopt into our daily routines that would help preserve and nurture failing oceans and marine life?
I think so, yeah. I think it sounds surprising, you know, saying we're taking too many fish out of the sea, and my conclusion may be actually, if we can try to eat local seafood, I think there's huge benefits, both in terms ultimately to the marine environment and also to local communities of doing that, local coastal communities anyway. We kind of talked about smaller boats with perhaps less focus on certain species. They don't always have to catch cod, for example. We can if we could really move to that as a trend, we can leave offshore areas to recover essentially as marine protected areas, and we can bring money into the local community. It can be hard to do, but if more and more people actually had a demand for local seafood, I think we'd be using less harmful methods to catch that, and there'd be the economic benefits of it as well. It is hard because actually most of the fish which we catch in the UK we export. I live in Poole next to Bournemouth, and it's really hard to buy local cockles and clams anywhere. There is now one place I've found which I can actually buy those, but the rest of them are actually shipped off either to Europe or further afield. But that would be my one kind of take-home message, if possible, to eat local seafood and appreciate what we have locally. And I think that could apply, globally as well. If everyone ate local seafood and appreciate what we have, it also put you more in touch with the marine environment, understand what's there and appreciate it a bit more.
Thank you very much. That was extremely much for taking the time out of what I'm sure is a very busy schedule to be with us today, Professor Stafford. It's very much appreciated. I just have a few concluding remarks. This podcast has been brought to you by the Sikh Human Rights Group. For more information about Professor Rick Stafford and the Sikh Human Rights Group's environmental and diversity policies, please visit our website, the link to which can be found within the description to this video. Or alternatively, please visit our Instagram account at SHRG_NGO. I have been Carter Buthnop. Thank you very much for listening.